Great, thank you, Steve. And Rushanara, please.
Thank you. Mr. Cameron, Eid Mubarak. I'm spending my afternoon with you instead of my family, and I'm looking forward to finishing and joining them. We've established that Mr. Sanjeev Gupta was a major customer of Greensill. Did you know how much money was being loaned to Mr. Gupta's Metal Empire GFG Alliance? Yes.
I don't have the exact figures. As I say, I wasn't involved in the credit committee. I wasn't responsible for extending credit, so I wasn't responsible for those decisions. So I don't have a figure for you.
The question was, did you know how much money was being loaned out to Gupta's Metal Empire?
No, I don't have that figure.
You didn't know? You didn't know?
I knew that GLG was a significant customer of Greensill. I knew there was an issue about client concentration. I asked questions about that. I was reassured there was a plan to deal with that. And I think that's one of the important reasons for this business not succeeding.
The Financial Times article in 2018 spoke about the Greensill link and described it as financial alchemy. And yet you talked earlier about doing the due diligence, and it seems like for someone who ran our country, that perhaps that due diligence didn't serve you well ultimately. I'm going to move on to another question. We established in the earlier comments and also the evidence you've submitted that you lobbied the Chancellor. You also lobbied the then Business Minister Nadeem Zahawi in June 2020. His department is responsible for the British Business Bank. And our understanding is that you are pressing for a maximum loan to Greensill that could be made under the Treasury's coronavirus large business interruption loan scheme, which was increased ultimately from 50 million to 200 million, and that was crucial. And so could we infer from what ultimately happened, which is that 8 times 50 million pounds of loans were split, and Mr. Greensill's company were able to then give that loan to GFG linked companies, that lobbying effort, that intensive lobbying effort, ultimately did pay off?
No, I wouldn't say that at all, because the Greensill approached, as I understand it, the British Business Bank to be accredited as a lender under these schemes, something which I had absolutely no involvement with. And it was accredited, as I think were some other fintech firms, not just traditional banks. So that was a successful approach. When Greensill asked to be raised to the higher level, that was ultimately rejected, I think, by the British Business Bank and by the Treasury. So no, I wouldn't agree with that formulation at all.
Okay, so did you, can I just check, did you discuss the British Business Bank as a possible route to getting funding for Greensill at your meeting with the Bank of England?
I don't believe I did. As I say, I wasn't at all involved until the moment of asking whether it could go up to the higher level in the British Business Bank accreditation process. My involvement with the Bank of England and the Treasury was all about the CCFF, because that was where I think we were most enthusiastic about having a product that we thought was even better than what they were suggesting and fitted in quite well.
And did you have, so you're pretty confident that you didn't discuss the other scheme, the CLBILS scheme, with the bank? What about, did you have any discussions with Nigel Boardman, who was a non-executive board member of the...
I must qualify something. Of course, Richard Sharp, I did have there's an text exchange in there. Richard Sharp, he wasn't at the bank at that stage, he was at the Treasury, but just make that point. Sorry, your question about Nigel Boardman.
Yes, did you have any discussions about the British Business Bank as a possible route to getting funding with Nigel Boardman? Have you had any conversation with him in the last couple of years? He was, after all, the exec board member, and also he's leading the inquiry that the current Prime Minister has announced.
I haven't got any record of conversations with him in the last 2 years. I can double check that. I certainly haven't discussed any of these issues with him, but I'm going to take part in his inquiry. I think I'm seeing him next week.
I hope you'll understand why I'm asking these questions, because there's a very close relationship between people in power, or people who have been in power like yourself, and what we have, as you've heard, is the spectre of £1 billion, as Lord Miners pointed out and others have pointed out, of public money potentially, certainly be at stake, and 3 to 5 billion lost to the taxpayer. And what we've heard today, you're suggesting that frankly, it feels like you're not taking responsibility for what's happened. I just want to come back to this point about Mr. Greensill. When he gave evidence on Tuesday, I asked the question about the loans to Mr. Gupta's companies. Can you just confirm for me the press reports that Greensill loaned a total of 400 million in the CLBILS loans to GFG linked companies, and that they were split across 8 loans of 50 million?
I don't have that information. As I say, I wasn't involved in any of those lending decisions, so I don't have that information and can't confirm that. Right.
So you don't know. You don't know.
Not for certain, no.
I mean, as a former Prime Minister, it seems like you either conveniently turned a blind eye on things, or you didn't do the due diligence properly, or you didn't have proper oversight, and your reputation is now in tatters, Mr. Cameron.
Well, I was an advisor to the company, and I thought I could help the company with some important tasks that included its international expansion and winning customers and working with partners. But I wasn't involved in lending decisions. I wasn't a director. I wasn't on the credit or risk committees. And I think that, that is a perfectly good way of working with a business. You're not responsible for the day-to-day decisions. You're not responsible for the lending decisions, but nonetheless, you're working with the team to try and help them expand the business. I talked about the due diligence that I did before joining the company. Obviously, I greatly regret this company's gone into administration, and there are lessons to learn from that, which I'm sure your committee are going to help us all to learn.
But the issue here is that Mr. Greensill's company did find a way of circumventing the 50 million cap, and ultimately 400 million pounds worth of government taxpayer-funded loans were made available to Gupta. And you know very well the risks to steel workers, thousands of them, and the wider impact on people and the taxpayer. Should you not take some responsibility for what's happened? Because it seems like, we're gonna, well, you're famously known as Teflon Man, you're very, you're a great survivor, and no one's taking responsibility. And yet taxpayers are going to be already affected, and they're going to continue to be affected by this.
Well, of course, I take responsibility for my decision to work with this business. I take responsibility for the decisions I made with respect to contacting the government for all of those things. As I said to you, I hope that these steel jobs survive. I'm not clear about, I watched Paul Miner's evidence about this cost to the taxpayer. I really think, your committee will be able to ask the Treasury for an accurate breakdown of what these costs should be, because we haven't, I think, seen those.
But at the very least, it's 400, with respect, at the very least, it will be 400 million at the very conservative estimate, because those are the loans.
Well, I think the difficulty is that, it is a criticism of Greensill that it was overexposed to Gupta and lent too much money to Gupta. But if you're saying that, it's hard to say at the same time that it wasn't trying to support jobs in the steel industry. I think perhaps the problem is there needed to be more skepticism from Greensill about Gupta and what was happening, rather than believing that actually the vision would be turned to reality. But we're getting a bit beyond our brief. But I think it's going to be a while before we know how this works out. But I hope we'll be able to have as many steel jobs in this country as we possibly can.
I think what I'm trying to establish is what I'm trying to understand is what the actual overall impact has been. You've been given a very hard time about the lobbying operation, and I would say that from ultimately from what happened, your association with Greensill and the lobbying operation that took place did actually in the end benefit the company that you were working with.
I don't follow that argument, I'm afraid, because what we were asking for, an extension of the CCFF to include supply chain finance, didn't happen. The Greensill's accreditation with the British Business Bank didn't involve any lobbying at all. It was Greensill going through the accreditation process. And like some other fintech companies, it was accredited as a CBILS lender. So the argument you're making, I don't follow, because actually, ultimately, the lobbying effort was unsuccessful. The Treasury gave good reasons for that, as I said in my evidence earlier.
And the Treasury also announced this new scheme. It was the Treasury Department, not the British Business Bank, which was the CLBLS scheme. So anyway, the point here is that this company ultimately did manage to access, through these 8 different £50 million loans, access loans, which were then provided to companies associated with Mr. Gupta, which has left the taxpayer short. I mean, can I just say that having listened to the evidence session and your response, I think what people will be really, really deeply concerned and alarmed about is that how you allowed, frankly, someone who was, using you here. Either at best he was using you, Mr. Greensill, and at worst, well, frankly, exploiting your reputation and bringing the office of the former Prime Minister into disrepute. And you kind of went along with it. You played along, and you should have been much, much more careful about the due diligence, and you turned a blind eye on things that were blindingly obvious.
Well, obviously, I take a different view, which is that I chose to work for Greensill because I thought it had a good core product in extending credit and early payment to small firms in our country. I believe that could be expanded with huge benefit. I believe that this could have been a UK fintech success story. Now, very sadly, that hasn't happened to be the case, but I did do due diligence. I did look at the board. I did look at the arrangements the company had in place. But obviously, I deeply regret that this company has failed, and that has consequences.
Yeah, and huge consequences. And I think, as those of us who've worked with you, it's bitterly disappointing. And frankly, this particular scandal is a huge, its reputation is so damaging to our democracy because of the office you held. But it's damaging in terms of real consequences to real people's lives.
Well, the point I would make is actually in our country, for all that I think we can improve transparency and rules around lobbying and everything else, is people can see when businesses meet with the government. We know that. In lots of countries we don't know that. And before I became Prime Minister, no one had any idea who was meeting with government. That is transparent. We have a lobbying act, so multi-client lobbyists have to declare who they lobby on behalf of. Of course, there's more we can do to improve these systems, but ultimately, a company I work with made a suggestion to the government turned it down, and the civil servants, I think, behaved impeccably throughout and have explained that what was done was perfectly appropriate and a sensible set of conversations were gone into. So I take a different view about how this happened. The sad thing is that the company itself has now failed and jobs have been lost, and that has real world consequences.
But I put it to you, Mr. Cameron, that what happened, and this was, don't forget, at a time when the government was dealing with public procurement contracts. You know, we now know that there was a separate VIP lane for government contracts, and your intense lobbying as a former prime minister made it very uncomfortable for ministers and for officials. And in the end, what I put to you is that, yes, the Treasury and others said no to you politely, but they found another route for you, which was through the British Business Bank, through the department, and that allowed. And if you look at the chronology of the announcements and that was made, that where the coronavirus large business interruption loan was introduced, it was done after that intensive lobbying. And I put it to you that actually you were successful ultimately in making sure that that company did benefit. And that this stuff smacks of favoritism and power. Those in power, like yourself, with powerful connections and relationships, getting access to decision makers and having that access to the VIP lane, the fast lane, into what you want. And that is fundamentally damaging to our democracy, and it puts the civil service, the impartial nature of our civil service, at a you know, in a very difficult position. And you should have known better, Mr. Cameron, not because of the thing you've said about lobbying. You were the architect of the Lobbying Act. You should have known better. And frankly, it's bitterly disappointing. And frankly, I have no pleasure in having to sit in this meeting with the former Prime Minister. Okay, you were, in your own words, you were the future once. I have no pleasure in being in this situation, sitting in front of you, and for the country to see the former Prime Minister being used in this way by, frankly, somebody who was close to, who was frankly acting like a con artist.
I just perhaps make one point on the application to the British Business Bank. I mean, I do believe that was a separate application process in which the Treasury wasn't involved, but it's a very good question for your committee to take up with the Treasury about whether that was a separate application process. I believe it was, but that might be one outcome of this conversation.
For announcing it. I'm very grateful to your time. I'm simply saying it's deeply disappointing, and I hope out of this episode and out of that experience that you've had, that we can make sure that no prime minister is ever caught up in a scandal of this nature, because it's bad for our democracy. It's bad for our impartial civil service. You will never be disassociated from the office of Prime Minister around the world. And even though you're not from my party, I have huge respect for the position of Prime Minister and a former Prime Minister, and it's bitterly disappointing what's happened. This whole episode is appalling for our country and our democracy.
Right. David, unless you had anything further to say, I think that brings us to the end of this